Awesome. So before we begin this keynote session, I did want to take some time to firstly start off by extending gratitude to Elder Fred McGregor for welcoming us to this unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation at the start of the conference yesterday. As representatives of all of our different organizations and institutions, I know that we are all well aware of our collective responsibility to advocate for systemic change that respects Indigenous sovereignty, elevates Indigenous knowledges, and protects against ecological destruction. And I think that the learning of this conference the past 2 days, I'm really hoping that it will help us all action this work as we go back to our own respective communities. Really excited to see how this work evolves for all of us. With that said, did want to jump into the keynote session here, and I'm very excited to get a chance to introduce Julius Lindsay from he's the Director of Sustainable Communities at the David Suzuki Foundation, and he leads the foundation's work to accelerate and raise the ambition of climate action in cities across this place known as Canada. He is also the co-founder of the Black Environmental Alliance, an organization that seeks to champion Black people in the environmental profession and provides a safe space for peer engagement to advocate, as well as to advocate for environmental justice for Black Canadians now and in the future. Prior to these roles, Julius has been a catalyst for the development of climate change plans and programs and policies for two of Ontario's largest cities, Mississauga and Richmond Hill. And Julius is also a Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Fellow and received their Existential Risk Funding Award for his digital initiative, which we'll talk more about today, the Prismatic Project. It's a project that combines futures games, community engagement, through the lens of Indigenous and Afrofuturist art to shift the conversation around and the composition of climate action in Canada. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Julius Lindsay. Awesome. So just before we begin, I did want to flag that we will have some time reserved at the end of the conversation for questions. So if anything is sparked throughout the conversation, hang on to that thought. There will be a runner with a mic. Marianne will be miking you up so you can engage in the conversation as well. All right, Julius, it's so great to be here with you. Just to start us off, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you first get involved in sustainability?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks everybody for having me here. I love telling this story because I actually studied physics and math in university, and so when I was done university, I got a job right out of university because I had student loans to pay, and so I got a clerical job at a provincial agency that I had worked at during the summer for a number of years, and at the time I had figured, I'm going to just spend like 3 or 4 years there and then go back and do my master's in physics. And so at the time, the Green Energy Act was coming into effect in Ontario, and there was a bunch of sort of climate action work happening. And literally somebody walked up to me one day and was like, Julius, you know math, you can do these greenhouse gas calculations. And I was like, sure. And so I did those greenhouse gas calculations, and that sort of sparked my interest in climate action and climate change. And at the time, this was close to 12, 15 years ago, the climate as a job was not really a thing, and so there was kind of taking off at the time, and I figured this is a really interesting place to spend my career, so I sort of learned on the job and gained knowledge through that way. And so I always say that I didn't choose this as a career, this career chose me.
I love that, the sustainability life chose you. So I've heard you say before that environmental justice is actually racial justice. Can you tell us more about what that means?
Yeah, when we look around Canada and when we look around the world, environmental effects and particularly climate effects disproportionately affect racialized communities. And so, and when we think about climate change as something that's happening in our world, it's driven by many of the same systems that are driving inequality in racial communities, things like white supremacy, things like capitalism, things like colonialism. And so we cannot sort of decouple these effects. And so the example I always use is that I've done some back-of-the-napkin calculations, and in the city of Toronto, there's a pretty close connection between summer temperatures, peak summer temperatures, and gun violence. And so as the temperature in the city goes up, the amount of gun violence in the city goes up. And correlation is not causation, but when you sort of think about the effects for racialized communities and for those who might undertake crime, and you have a really hot summer and folks are living in buildings that do not have air conditioning, and I grew up in a house that did not have air conditioning. When that temperature hits 20 degrees at night and you're not sleeping and you're irritable, and then you go out in the world and something happens, you are more likely to react in a violent way. And so we have to create those kinds of connections beyond sort of just thinking about climate as an environment issue and into how it connects with other issues and how the effects of climate change are going to affect these other issues, but also how these systems drive climate change in our society.
For sure, and I think the interconnectivity of it all is so important to recognize. I touched on this a little bit in your intro, but can you tell us a little bit about the Black Environmental Alliance and how that plays into all of this?
Yeah, so it was funny. It was the year of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that was a really tough time for racialized community, particularly for Black people throughout the place that's now known as North America. And we were deep in the pandemic at the time, so we were at home, and my wife was having conversations with folks at work. She had formed an employee resource group of Black folks in her ministry. She works for the provincial government here in Ontario. And I was looking around and I had nobody to have that conversation with. I've actually, in my 18 years of working in this career, I've never worked directly with another Black person. And so, I basically was like, I'm just gonna reach out to every Black person I know who work in this space, and let's get together and just have a conversation. And so I reached out to a whole bunch of people. I think that first day we had about 12 people come out. And, of those 12 people, only 3 people brought those folks to the table. And so most people did not actually know another Black person who worked in this space. And so we just had a conversation about what was happening at work, what was going on in the world, how it was affecting us. Everybody had very similar experiences. And so at the end of that conversation, I said to folks, do you want to just get together and continue talking, or do you want to do something? And the general consensus around the room, as it is often with racialized communities, we want to do something. And sort of that's how the Black Environmentalist Alliance was born.
No, I love that story. And I think that Melania had mentioned this in her conversation yesterday, but about just creating gifts for the future as well. So the experience of isolation that you felt is not going to hopefully be something that is continued into future generations as well. So digging more into the environmental justice side of things, I know Majora Carter, an urban revitalizer and activist from the South Bronx, has defined environmental justice as meaning no community should be saddled with more environmental burden and less environmental benefits than another. Can you talk to us more about what that means, that kind of discrepancy between burdens and benefits and how that's playing out?
Yeah, I think that, as I said earlier, the effects of climate change disproportionately affect marginalized communities. And also these are communities that are often not heard within the environmental movement. The environmental movement itself was sort of born out of this idea of conservation, and that nature was something over there that you traveled to and kind of spent recreational time in, you kept pristine, and then you went back to your house. And this idea of these very separate concepts is something that we need to wrestle with when we're thinking about environmentalism, when we're thinking about solutions to climate change. Many solutions to climate change have not heard from racialized communities. They do not serve racialized communities. They can actively harm racialized communities. And so, we need to think about, how these effects affect these communities, and also how the solutions can help these communities. Sorry. And so, there's this long-standing feeling in the environmental movement of we're saving the world. Many people work in the environmental movement. Some people have worked for 20, 30, 40 years. They believe that they've been spending 20, 30, 40 years saving the world. And so when you go to them and say these solutions do not work for everybody, it can be quite challenging. And so we need to keep in mind as we do this work going forward about who are these solutions centering. Right now I work in cities, and so in most cities when you go to and they talk about electric vehicles, they'll talk about the paradigm of 80% of people are going to charge their vehicles at home. And so, when we think about that paradigm, and they're 80% of people now are charging vehicles at home, so how do we get vehicle chargers into our homes? But when you think about who owns an electric vehicle today, somebody who can afford a Tesla, who owns their own home, and also has enough money to put a charging station in their home. And so we're building a paradigm around people who can, who own land, who own a $60,000 plus car, and on top of that have the money to put a charging station in their home. And so, what about the people who don't have enough money to put a charging station in a home? What about people who live in apartment buildings or in condos who don't have control over their parking spot? What about people who their car is their home? How are we building a paradigm that are going to center those folks? Because there are many more of those folks than the folks who live in a house who can afford a Tesla and who can put a charging station in their home. And so, I'm in my work now, I'm really in a place where I try and think about how can we challenge these paradigms that have been built for a very specific person without the thought of those that we have not centered up till now.
For sure, and I think it's so important to be mindful not only of the people that are, coming up with these solutions, but who's missing from those spaces. And, when it comes to especially addressing complex issues like climate change, I've heard you speak a bit about this around the concept of net zero. So you've mentioned in the past that when it comes to net zero, we need to adopt an abundance mindset and a multiverse approach here. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and how exactly it is we need to be approaching this concept here, considering the diverse needs of different communities, not just in Canada, but also globally?
Yeah, we often talk about climate change as a fight. And, I did some interviews on CBC this morning, and there was a question about, how do we get these wins? And I just recently said to somebody that, if you concern yourself in climate action about wins, don't be surprised when someone else is talking about what other people are losing. And so, climate action for me is not a zero-sum game. We need to think about how can this work and how can these benefits benefit everyone? And how do we include all of those voices into this work? And I add the multiverse approach because, I'm a huge science fiction fan. And, when you watch a show like Star Trek, there is sort of one future. We have this idea of the future. We don't talk about futures, we talk about the future. But when you think about the world now, we have multiple realities in our future right now. And so how are we thinking about these multiple realities that are going to exist in the future, particularly from a climate change perspective? When we talk about, if we were to turn off all of the greenhouse gas taps today, we're still going to see the effects of climate change. We're still going to see warming. We're still going to see extreme weather. But when you think about thinking globally, how weather is going to change in Toronto, where I live, versus how weather is going to change in Iqaluit, versus how temperature is going to change in Bogota, Colombia, that weather is going to change in very different ways. Those local contexts are very different. So we need to build processes that may have similar processes, but look at multiple outcomes, because we often think of this future like the low carbon future. There's literally a climate action textbook that you can go on the internet and buy, and a very influential large organization that's doing work behind it. And so for me, it's again, we come back to this concept of who's not missing who's in that conversation? Who are the people who are pushing that? How are these solutions working for others? Going back to the electric vehicle conversation, if you cannot answer the question of how is an electric vehicle going to enable net zero in rural South Africa, if that has no concept, if you have no answer to that question, then maybe your climate action is a little bit too narrow, and maybe you're thinking about this in your context. There are people that I work with who think that EVs are a false solution. We should not be thinking about EVs. Recently traveled to Florida because my wife has family down there. A local road in Tampa Bay is 6 lanes. We are not transforming that land use pattern in the next 10 years, let alone the mindsets of the folks who live there, who are used to jumping in their car and driving everywhere they need to go. Mm-hmm. And so how are we thinking about the solutions? And EV is a real solution there, because to be able to change in the time that we need to change, we're not tearing down those roads and building all the transit and building up, with the challenges of just in the mindsets of the folks. And so how are we thinking about these different solutions in different areas, and how are we thinking beyond this? This is the solution, and this is the way that we have to go. And I think that's a trap that in climate action we often fall into, that we need to kind of move beyond. And so that's why I use that word multiverse. It's a very timely word about thinking about the future, multiple futures, in that we are going to see in our world and the solutions that will get us there.
Awesome. And what do you see as the role of community here in terms of public engagement and getting to net zero?
Well, there's the role of community, and I'm biased because I've spent most of my career working in communities, that communities are where where climate action solutions are going to be found. I worked in the city of Mississauga. 15% of the city's emissions came from one cement plant in the city. And so if I said to you, the cement plant, a fuels company, and the city of Mississauga transit system were going to partner to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, would you have any idea what I'm talking about? But those three companies got together. The cement plant had very low electricity rates overnight because of the way the electricity rate system works in Ontario. It's negative, so they would pay you to use electricity. Using that electricity, they could produce hydrogen that they could then sell to the city to use in their buses, which would rapidly decarbonize the city's largest greenhouse gas emission, which is the transit system. But then the cement plant would use the oxygen that was created from splitting the oxygen and hydrogen molecules to do carbon capture on their stack, because cement is a very carbon intense industry, and there's currently no substitute for cement, so it would allow them to capture their carbon and repurpose into natural gas or into renewable natural gas. And so how do we create those kinds of innovation ecosystems at the community level? Federal government is not going to be able to create the atmosphere for something like that to happen. That's a very local way of looking at it. And similarly on the adaptation side, in terms of the changes that I talked about earlier, for me, I'm a bit of a climate change adaptation purist, that you have to understand the local risks to be able to address climate change. And so a lot of the work that I did in cities was around engaging with residents to understand what the impacts of climate change are and how that plays out actually in the community. When I was in Richmond Hill, we put together a stakeholder panel of folks within the city, and I actually had one of our residents who ran one of our environmental community groups come up to me during that session and was like, you have the provincial energy regulator, you have our electricity utility, you have this university, you have that school board, why am I here? And I said, and this is somebody who worked for the province, this is somebody who was trained as a scientist, and I said to them, our utility is an expert on electricity and electricity delivery in the city. Our school board is an expert on some of the community aspects and sort of learning, but you are an expert of living in Richmond Hill. And so, we need you here to be able to inform these solutions of how this will actually play out in Richmond Hill. And oftentimes, again, working in cities, somebody brought this up yesterday, I forget which session I was in. It was today during one of the sessions. Somebody spoke about a town hall, we should have town halls, we could work the city. And, I spent many years in cities seeing town hall happens, and a town hall is like, okay, we put up a bunch of boards with information, we invite the community in, and we have a conversation with them, and oftentimes it's like, we find you mildly annoying, but we have to do this because it's a compliance exercise, so we're going to do it. And the same 5 people show up for that every single time. I worked in cities for 10 years, and I say I've never attended a city event that I did not work at. You heard my introduction in the beginning. I have a full-time job. I have an NGO on the side. I'm doing this major project out of my back pocket. I have 2 young children. I have family. Going to City Hall and spending 2 hours talking to staff does not work for me. And for many people, and for many diverse backgrounds, many reasons why, even if somebody showed up there, that would not work for them. And so, where I am in my career and the work that I'm doing is really about focusing on how do we change that paradigm? How do we actually engage folks in communities? How do we actually hear from folks in the community? And for many different parts of the community, how do we bring those people in? How do we hear their voices? And how do we incorporate that into climate action? One of the things we did when I was building the climate change plan in Mississauga is we ran a climate change escape room. So we partnered with an escape room company in the city. We built this climate change escape room. We did a sort of pre-survey and post-survey of people doing the escape room. And for those who don't know what an escape room is, it's basically a game where they kind of lock you in a room and you have to solve puzzles and you have a time limit to escape. And so, we did that partially because the escape room had its own audience. It had a mailing list, had a bunch of people who went there and played their games. Those people we would never get out, would never show up to a city event where we put up boards and people talk to people. But also we were able to engage people and find out from them, what do you want to see in the city? What is the climate action you want to take? Without actually asking that question. Again, going back to that, does a person actually understand if I go to them and say, what climate action do you want to see in the city? Do they know how to answer that question? Do they feel equipped to answer that question? And I knew it was successful the day when we were recruiting some folks for our team, so I was sitting with my HR person, and they were new, so they were like, tell me about your program, tell me about your area, and so we were talking about climate action, the city, and the plan we were building, and he was like, oh yeah, I was at the mall this weekend, and I did this escape room, and my kid had lots of fun, and he learned so much, and I was like, yeah, that was us. He worked for the city, and he did not know that he was being engaged by the city in the development of his climate change action plan. And his child learned something, and he had fun with his kid. He went there, he had fun with his kid, but they learned, and they experienced, and they walked away with something tangible that they could use in climate action. And for me, that was the really important point. We got 1,000 people to go through that escape room. Those are unheard numbers for a single tactic in a city engagement. But the company had a captive audience. We had a bunch of events that we had a captive audience. And so, we found ways to engage people at their level, in their place, and in ways that they engaged and they didn't even really know that they were being engaged for something that is very technical.
No, that's great. I think it's so important to be meeting people where they're actually at. And what you're doing to center solutions around community, it's only possible by trying different approaches. So, the project that I touched on in your introduction, the Prismatic project, it sounds like it's doing just that. Are you okay to share a little bit more context around what that is and your creative approach there?
Yeah, so it's really informed by a lot of the things I've said up till now. But really the way the project works, and I guess I'll give a little bit of background firsthand if people don't know what strategic foresight is. So strategic foresight is actually an area of practice and a growing body of work where instead of in terms of strategic planning, you kind of come up with a goal and you figure out your actions to get to that goal. Strategic foresight, you use trends and signals of things that are going on now to imagine multiple futures to understand what is probable futures, what are desired futures, what may be less probable futures, and use that kind of body of information to understand and to better plan for getting to the future that you might want or taking the actions you might want. And so the project itself, Prismatic, is really building a game that allows you to do that. So you play the game, and in playing the game, you generate futures using signals and trends from the present. And so for those of you who participated in the systems workshop yesterday, some of the things you did within that workshop are the things you would do within this game. And so the idea is that interested climate groups, interested individuals could play the game and generate these futures. The game itself is going to build in Afro and Indigenous ways of knowing and being into the mechanics of the game, because we really want people to sort of step outside of this sort of typical, as I said earlier, these are the climate change actions and we just need to get on with it, into different ways of knowing and being, and engage with those to start to understand how we can imagine the future differently. And so that data is used in two ways. If an organization plays the game, they get their data fed back to them as a strategic planning document. So you get a document that you can use in your organization for strategic planning. And there's a bit of a transaction there because we don't want to be just you taking your data and doing all this cool stuff with it and you get nothing. And so the data would be fed back to those organizations to be able to use for strategic planning. But the overall data set is going to go onto an online platform where people can interact with it, they can learn from it, they can build connections and help within the synthesis of it. And then once that sort of synthesis happens, that data set is given to Afrofuturist and Indigenous futurist artists to create futures from a very specifically Afro or Indigenous perspective. And really the premise there is that we're going to be having futures created based on data generated from across the country that will challenge our typical paradigm, our typical capitalist, colonial, white supremacist paradigm of how we are taking climate action within this country. And so the idea is to put that artwork out, and we're being very agnostic about sort of what that artwork looks like. It could be stories. My favorite is there's an artist from Toronto who creates Afrofuturist cities from all black Lego. I'm a big Lego fan. And so you can imagine giving that data set to that artist and him literally building an Afrofuturist city out of all black Lego and then activating that city in terms of having conversations about how is that different from the future that we currently talk about related to climate action. And so, I'm really excited about the potential of the project, and I've been pretty lucky that everybody we've talked with this project has been excited about it. When I first conceptualized this, I had this conversation with my wife, and she looked at me like I had 5 heads. And so I took that personally, like, I'm going to make this happen. And so, it's been really interesting to sort of work on building this project. I'm in the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Fellowship. I'm part of another fellowship that's going to be announced very soon that I shouldn't even be publicly talking about, but it's going to be announced pretty soon. And so I'm really excited by the sort of the excitement that people find about the project, but also the possibilities of centering my community within that conversation and seeing what kind of interesting and non-typical things come out of that project.
No, I love the different angles you're taking to bring different perspectives into these spaces. And thinking of the people in this room here specifically, what advice would you have for leaders in this space who are looking to further the design of programs in the sector here?
Yeah, so I'm gonna. I was a part of the systems exercise yesterday, and my first point, we were asked to describe a word, but without using the word. And so in my partner, we did it kind of in twos. And so the person that I was with, I talked about working together in mutually beneficial ways, and not just like being mutually supportive, but actually like working together, building together, like working hand in hand, side by side, as opposed to like I'm doing my thing and I'm sharing with you and you're doing your thing to sharing with me. And so that is sort of my definition of collaboration. And I think oftentimes when we think about collaboration, it is that like I know what I want and I know what I'm trying to do, and so who wants to work with me on that? As opposed to like, how do we actually work together to build something that's going to be mutually beneficial, that's going to be beneficial to all our communities and go beyond sort of, what I see or what I want. I've talked a lot about the work that I'm doing, and even the Prismatic project, and I really think that there is a space for innovative partnerships. I was actually surprised in that conversation that I had, I think it was yesterday, that there were folks in their science centers who had never worked with their cities. And so like, if you're working on climate action, I guarantee you, if you go to your city's climate action person and say, I want to have a conversation, let's work together, they're going to email you every day for the next 3 months until you follow through, because those people are generally the only person, they're generally underfunded, and they're generally looking for ways to engage their community that are not sort of the typical, set up boards in a room. In the escape room project that we talked about, we were very fortunate that the company saw this as a business development opportunity, so we did it on a shoestring budget, which meant we didn't have to get any approvals, and they got a lot of juice out of it, we got a lot of juice out of it. We got inquiries from across the continent of people who are interested in what we did and how we did it, and so I think it's really about finding those supportive partnerships that go beyond what you might typically think of, or even beyond the people in this room. And I think I always say the best conference that I've ever been to and the most informative on my work was a graphic design conference. It was not a climate change themed graphic design conference, it was just a graphic design conference. And I went there and I learned so much about my work, and I found so many innovative solutions that if I just tweaked them a little bit, I could use them in my work and apply it to my method. And so, I'm a big believer, and particularly in climate change that touches so much of our society, it's really about interdisciplinary solutions. When I was in Mississauga, we had a conversation between an economic development person, a person from the arts, and an engineer, and it was one of the most generative, exciting conversations that I had ever been a part of. And I know all 3 of those people showed up to that meeting like, what are we going to talk about? I don't understand why I'm in the room with these other folks. But once they started getting into it and talking about it, like watching an artist and an economic development person who's essentially an accountant and an engineer have a conversation about climate action and public engagement, like I'm not sure that I've seen anything in my career that I've found more beautiful. The intersectionality piece I think is really important. Climate action is often seen in this bubble of environment, and even within our own organization, there's people who are challenged with looking at these issues and how they connect. I spoke earlier about the sort of connection between climate and gun violence, and I'll go back to that example because in the city of Toronto, for those of you who are familiar with Toronto, from Toronto, we had the Year of the Gun, and that summer we had more gun violence in that summer than we've ever had before, and I think ever since. That summer was unnaturally hot, which was part of it, but also that summer was the graduation year of the elimination of grade 13 in Ontario, and the bringing in of zero tolerance rules within the TDSB and the TDCSB in Toronto. And so you throw together, racialized and low-income kids getting kicked out of school, the rise of crime in the city, extremely hot temperatures, and you end up with a summer with more gun violence ever seen in the city. And I was sitting there like, this is so obvious, but I never heard anybody have that conversation that year or since. And so, when we think about these issues, we cannot think about them in sort of a siloed mentality. We have to think about the systems and the ways that these interact with each other. I think it was yesterday there was a racial presentation, and they talked about the amount of money that folks make. A white man, a racialized man, a white woman, and racialized women. And I was thinking about the racialized women piece because if you break that down into a South Asian woman, a black woman, a Latinx woman, an indigenous woman, and people with intersecting identities like a black indigenous woman or an Afro-Latino woman, the spectrum on that sort of amalgamated number would be huge. And so how do these, we can't look at climate change as this single issue that is sort of standalone and we just need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Many of our systems in our society are driving the fact that we have all these greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gas emissions are based on the extractive colonial systems that we have within our society. And so to solve them, we have to address all of these issues, because just focusing on, if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we'll save the world, is really not going to save the world. The last piece here that I really want to focus on is locality. And, I touched on this a little bit, but I think we often think about climate change, we want to bring it up to the global level, and I try and do the opposite. I feel like oftentimes when you talk about climate change, people think about islands sinking in the Pacific, polar bears that are losing their homes. I was just speaking to somebody yesterday or earlier this week, and they said that they had talked to one of their residents, and the resident had said, we've never seen effects of climate change within the GTA. And I'm like, 10 years ago, we had a flood that literally wiped out 80% of our electricity. We had an ice storm that for 2 weeks, people did not have heating or electricity in their homes. That was 10 years ago. We're almost at the 10-year anniversary. The flood was July 8th, 2013. And so how short our mindsets that we had this major climate event here that just 2 in 1 year, because the ice storm was in December, 2 in 1 year, and how quickly people have forgotten those effects that happen, or don't make the connection that these are the things that we're going to continually see within our world. This morning I did those interviews, and there's a question like, how are we going to experience climate change? I'm like, we're experiencing right now. We have forest fires raging in our west coast. There are cities as far as Winnipeg going under air quality advisories. Like, these things are playing out now, and they're going to play out more frequently as we go forward. And so I think the local piece and understanding the local context is so important. I take the city of Toronto. We often think of Toronto as a city. It's a community. Toronto is a community of communities. The context of a racialized person who lives in the northwest corner of the city in a low-income basis is much different than somebody who lives on the lakeshore in a well-affluent community who might own their own homes, live in a single family home. And so we have to think about those local contexts. That's where the risk comes in, because the risk to somebody who lives in a home is different to somebody who lives in a tower. When power is out for an extended period of time, at least in the city of Toronto, most buildings, water only gets to the 10th floor. And so think about the people who live above the 10th floor. How are they accessing the most basic human need of water? And then you think about a lot of these buildings, like my aunt, she lives in Toronto Community Housing. She's lived there for 40 years. She's not walking down 10 floors of stairs to go and get water. So how are we providing support to that person who is a racialized woman who lives in low income housing, who is, my aunt is 80 something years old. And so, again, talking about the effects, these are the ways that these affect our most vulnerable in society. And if we are not taking an approach where we're thinking about those people and creating solutions for those people, then when we implement solutions, we're going to miss those people.
So what does all of this mean when it comes to how we need to kind of think or rethink about impact? What you mentioned earlier about collaborations, one of the barriers to that is I've got my directives and the things that I need to report on. You've got your directives and the things that you need to report on. How do we create that meaningful space for us to come together and make that third thing meaningfully?
Well, I think part of it is sort of thinking beyond that scarcity mindset. We have to enter in this work in a supportive manner, in a manner of working together, in a manner of true collaboration. There are a lot of people who do this work, and like I said earlier, they're out for their wins. They're out to be able to win. They're out to say that this is what I did. And I work at a foundation. Much of the philanthropy world is about tell me exactly what you're going to do and measure it so I know exactly what's done with my money. And so, this is driving this scarcity mindset, this competition mindset, when really, and I know there's a movement in the philanthropy world to think about how do we think beyond that? How can we do trust-based granting where we give people money and it's like, do whatever you want with it, come up with solutions, you know best. And I think there's another sort of level to that is around community. And so, I think there's a piece, and Melanie said this yesterday around relationships being really important. And, I often say this to folks who worked in cities, and I used to say this when I worked in a city, like, you shouldn't be talking to people when you need something from them. You should be talking to them now and building that relationship so when you need something from them, then you can have that conversation. If you went to your friend and asked them to borrow $1, you went to somebody on the street to ask them to borrow $1, you're more likely to get that from your friend because you have that relationship. Most people on the street, if you stop them to ask them for $1, they're going to think you're crazy and they're going to run from you. And so, how do we build mutually beneficial relationships prior to the want or the need? We go into communities when we want something or when we need something or we want to do something, and we have in our mind, well, this is what the community best needs, as opposed to going to the community and saying, what do you need? How can we do this? How can we support you in what you're doing? There's a story from the city of Detroit. They recently had a tree planting program. So basically you call the city, I want a tree, they come out, they plant it on your yard, they do everything, they pay for it, they clean it up. All you gotta do is make that phone call. And nobody was up taking it. And so they hired somebody to go out in the community and figure out, why isn't anybody taking this up? And the person went out and talked to the community, and the community was like, yeah, 20, 30 years ago in the 70s, they came and cut down all the trees because they wanted to surveil the neighborhoods. And so there was this lack of trust between the community and the city, that the city was just like, oh, we're offering this program, we're going to give out these trees, everybody's going to take them, not understanding that there was already existing trauma within the community related to trees. And we don't often think about that, the fact that this is what happened in the community. And so they had to go out and talk to people, build relationships, understand who are those trusted people in the community that we can work with to get people to uptake this program. But when we center ourselves and we're just like, oh, we're going to give out trees, everybody's going to want this, the solutions aren't going to work, and they don't center and they don't get at the challenges that are actually happening in our communities. And so I think that's a really important part of this work. The last part that I wanted to touch on in this section is really around the solutions, and I've sort of said this over the talk, but I want to kind of really hit it home here that, there is this idea that we know what we need to do, we just need to get on with it. And I think there needs to be a lot of space in this effort of coming up with solutions. And I know, I speak, the talk that I was, the interviews that I was doing this morning was on this report that was just recently released that said we're going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 5 years. And, the question is, oh my God, it's urgent, the world's falling apart. But, if we say that and we just lock in solutions that we have on our plate now, we are leaving out so many people, and I won't even talk about around the world, in our communities. And so if we want to build a future for everyone and we want justice for everyone, part of this work really needs to be around creating solutions, about hearing from people, about bringing people together to hear their voices and create those solutions. That's going to work for many people, and not just default to these solutions that either do not work for people, that people are distrustful of, or just actively harm people. And so I think that's a really important part of sort of the future of this work. And where I am in this space, I feel that anxiety of wanting to do something, but I'm also like, my community has been erased. I experience erasure in my work on almost a weekly basis. And so I do not want to, submit my community to that. And so I have to commit to hearing from my community. I have to commit to taking that time to build solutions that those folks have participated in, that they can contribute to, and that work for them. And because that's my community, I want to do that for all communities, and particularly communities that are most marginalized within our society. And so, I feel a commitment to my community to do that work, and commitment to all communities to do that work, because I do not want to be a part of that ongoing erasure and that ongoing marginalization that often happens in our work.
So important to invest the time in building authentic, genuine relationships there. Love that you mentioned that. So we have some time now to take questions from the audience, but I will kick things off as folks think about what their questions are. What do you see as the role for youth in co-creation and leadership in this space?
I'm fortunate enough to know and be in community with a number of young, racialized climate leaders, and I am constantly impressed by the work that these folks are doing. When I was 21, 22, I had not accomplished a third of the amount that these folks have done. And so I think there's a real space for leadership in this work for those folks. I did a webinar, I think it was last week, and I was how did they put it? I was the one with the storied history, and the other folks were all quite young, and there was a few folks there who were like, I don't feel comfortable being on the same stage as Julius because he's done all these amazing things in his career. And I was like, you all are doing amazing things. And the piece that I think is really important for youth is that some of these intersections are like inherent for them. They have not grown up with an environmentalism that is exclusive and that is based on, people traveling to their cottage or a park in their neighborhood. I was thinking about this today as I was thinking about the talk. Like, my parents come from the country of Grenada. There's no such thing as a park in Grenada. Like, in Grenada, you have your house, the bush is over there, you live, you have all kinds of animals running through your house. Like, you live in context with nature. There is no separation between, with the exception of the capital city. And even within the capital city, there is, nature is right there. And so this idea of, we have to protect our park and we travel up to Muskoka to go to our cottage, that is not a part of our context. And many of these children who are, children of immigrants, or even just, learning about climate change and learning about these issues as they grow up, they have a more inherent understanding and intersections to things like racial justice, intersection to things like social justice. They've been educated about these systems and how they drive these challenges. And so I think, oftentimes when I have these conversations with these folks, there is no, it's second nature. They look at you with three heads if you're not having that conversation. And so I think there's a real role there for that inherent understanding for somebody like me, and I use the words of my colleague Saba Khan from EnviroMuslims. I just pass the mic to them. I empower them. I give them a voice because they understand it and they bring that sort of inherent knowledge to it, and that no nonsense of this is what you do. This is not a conversation or an option. And so, I really believe that as we empower youth, as we have these conversations with youth, it's really about sort of connecting and tapping into that inherent knowledge of systems that, many of us may not have.
No, Amazing. And I'm looking at my team now because I know we have the privilege of working with a lot of young people through the work that I do, and the no-nonsense approach is so real, and there's so much talent in our communities, and definitely, it's important to engage them in the solutions as we look to build them. So Marianne is traveling and has her eyes open to capture any folks that have questions, so please flag her down.
The system works. Thank you, Julius, and thank you, Turfa, as well for the presentation. My name is Alan. I'm from Edmonton, and I just near the end of your talk, you talked about erasure, racialized erasure, and I'm really curious to hear more about that, just to sort of understand it a little bit better, in part, so maybe I can help prevent that.
Yeah, so I'll tell two stories. And the first story, my second day at the foundation, we were having a conversation about risk. And so you've heard sort of my history, and I have sort of 10 plus years of working in climate risk. And I asked the question about, like, is the foundation looking at its climate risk? And the response was somebody explaining to me about risk. And so, like, here's an issue that I have 10 years of experience. This is somebody who's seen my resume, who was a part of the interview panel that brought me to the foundation. They decided to explain to me about what risk was and how you deal with it. And so, somebody like me, when I show up, there's this assumption that you don't know well, or you're new to the field, or that you have some way to develop, and that you are not an established leader. And I am trying to be shameless in saying that I am one of the top municipal climate people in the country, and I am erased in that way. And it happened to me again last week, where I was having a conversation with somebody, and again there was the person said to me, like, "Oh, Julius, you have to deal with difficult staff. That's just something that you have to do." And I'm like, "I've been managing staff since I was in university." And so, like, again, like, there was this assumption that, as a black man, I'm a new leader. I have to understand how the world really works. Like, I don't have an understanding of how the world really works. And this is things that happen to me in my career very frequently. One of the top environmental awards programs in Canada, I wrote an open letter saying, like, your program is problematic because your application process is exclusionary. And the response to that letter was the person calling to me and trying to explain to me, like, mansplain to me. As a man, it's weird to be mansplained to, but mansplain to me about this is how the industry really works. And, you don't understand. I'm 40. They're like, "Oh, you're 40 years old. You don't know what you're talking about." And just this assumption that I had no idea what I was talking about when, I am a racialized person. I looked at that application, and you can see I have rather large hair. I wear my beard long as an issue of self-love, because black hair there's a lot of trauma and exclusivity around black hair. I wear my beard long very intentionally, and their photo requirements would have cut that off in the picture. Like, my hair up here and my hair down here would have been cut off. And so I said that, like, this is a part of my identity, it's a part of who I am, and your requirements are erasing that from me. And that's not the way that I think this program should be run. And so, these sort of examples are ways in which, people show up and they are automatically discounted. And so part of my work is that, I don't want to be that discounted person. That's part of the reason why the Alliance exists, is to say that black people in this industry exist. We have voices. We've done amazing work. Everybody in the group that I work with are doing amazing things. Some people are directors at NGOs. Some people are independent award-winning consultants. Like, these are all people who are doing, even the students or the people who are new grads are doing amazing work. But you would not hear about any of those folks. Over this past Black History Month, I did an article for the foundation, sort of speaking about being a black person in this field, and I shared that article of, like, here I am talking about my experience in the field, but literally in the last 5 years, every year during Black History Month, there is an article written about black people in the environmental sector and the experiences. And, like, the same article written over and over by different people saying the same thing. And so, like, you know, how are we changing that? How are we challenging those paradigms? I am the only black man in my organization. I'm one of 3 black people in my organization of 100 people. I'm the first black director, I think, in the history of the foundation. Like, there's a lot of responsibility with that, but there's also a lot of, there's a reason why there's never been a black person in this position. And it's not just because there's no one qualified, because there are many people over the years who have been qualified. And so when we look at our industry, when we look at this work, like, we have to think about the ways in which people are being excluded, and systemically. This is not a coincidence. This is not interpersonal. You know, I said this at work recently, like, racism is not a verb, it is a noun. It is a system. Racism is a system, it is not a descriptor. And so, you know, everybody cannot, you know, you cannot divorce yourself from this work. You cannot divorce yourself from the impact of this within our society. And I think in the environmental field, it's particularly acute because, as I said earlier, you have people who have worked in this field for 30 years who think they've been doing they've been saving the world for 30 years. And so you go to somebody who thinks they've been saving the world for 30 years and say you've been harming people for 30 years, like, I understand the emotional challenge that represents. Because the work that you're doing may have been harming people. The systems that you're supporting may have been harming people, may have not been doing good. And that's hard to hear when you've been working for 30 years and thinking that you've been doing 100% good.
So important to be constantly checking our blind spots to make sure that that's not happening, because we're all, you know, nobody's immune to it. Any other questions? Don't be shy. I've got another one for you. So when it comes to your experience so far, talk to us about rosebud and thorn. So what's something that you're super proud of? What's something that is emerging and growing for you? And what's a challenge that you're struggling with?
Yeah, I'll start with the emerging part, and that goes back to that sort of youth leadership. And I'm really excited by the fact that many of the emerging organizations are started by young, racialized people. They are creating their own spaces. They are doing this work. They are really rocking it. You know, the person on my team, that the top performer in my team is somebody who graduated from university last year. And they are undoubtedly my top performer on my team, and I'm super impressed by them and know that they are going to go on to do amazing things. And they've also started their own organization on the side. And so I see this as an emerging trend that I'm really excited about. The thorn, I've kind of touched on it, is this ongoing fight for, let's say, even though I kind of badmouthed that word before, but this fight or this struggle around continuing to raise voices and also continuing to explain what's going on. And, you know, I often do talks like these, and you know, it's great to share, but it also gets annoying when you're in spaces with people that you've had this conversation multiple times before, and there's still that, well, why? Like, give me the specifics, make me understand, do the work of explaining for me. And there's been a few sessions today that I've seen. There was one about Science North did an Indigenous hiring program and specifically talked about, like, this is our work, not the work for Indigenous folks to do. Do not put that work on Indigenous folks. You know, at work I recently gave a talk and I said, you know, this connection to racial justice is challenging, but don't run to your racialized coworker to assuage your guilt. Like, this is something you need to work with or talk to your boss because they are paid to manage you. And so that's a part that I find quite challenging. And then on the excited or the rose side, I think I'm going to go back to Prismatic. We're, I think, about a third of the way to funding the project, and it's been really crazy to be like, I have this cool idea, and go on and actually have people give you money to implement this cool idea. And so that I'm pretty excited about. Lots more work to do, lots more funding to understand. And I'm doing this project, if it isn't clear, this project is not related to my work at the foundation or to my work at the Alliance. This is something that I'm sort of doing on my own. And so to have the accomplishments that we've had thus far is I'm really excited about, and really excited to, actually implement the project. As I said earlier, like, I'm a big science fiction and Afrofuturism fan. I'm also a big gamer, so I love board games. I love sort of playing games and community games as well. And so to be able to think like I will have a board game that I made is like just I can't even believe it, and I haven't even done it yet. So I'm really, really excited about that. But I'm lots more work to do.
I'm excited to have the opportunity to try it out hopefully one day. Pause again for any other questions from the audience.
Question over there.
Hi there, Sophie from Moncton. Have you faced, or have you had to deal with ageism in the climate change and all that, where the young generation kind of are mad at the older generation because they feel like they're the one who broke the environment personally or something like that, and how to reconcile that gap?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've never faced ageism from that perspective. I think that there is an understanding of like the fact that these systems are driving climate change. This is something that we, like youth, have not done. But I think as well, youth understand that we need you and you need us. And so much of the ageism I've seen is actually the other way. And I can use an example of when I was in Richmond Hill, we did this co-creation project. So we hired a facilitator, and we basically gave the group the money and the facilitator, and we brought together a group of community groups and youth and interested individuals, and we were like, here's the money, go create something. And so many people in the group were like, but what are we creating? And I'm like, you're gonna figure that out. You're gonna use the facilitator and the money, and you're gonna create it because it needs to work for you. And they're like, no, but what are we creating? And I'm like, no, you're gonna figure that out. And so there was one person particularly in the group. The person was a past president of professional engineers in Ontario. They're a professor at one of our colleges. And that person would literally get physically mad within facilitated discussions because his words were not just taken at face value. So he would come in with these sort of grand statements of fact, and the fact that they weren't centered and sort of taken in as this is law, he really struggled with that. And so I often find that the ageism is actually directed the other way, and similar to what I experienced of, even though I feel like so absurd saying I experienced ageism at age 40, but this idea that you're young, you don't really know how this works, your opinions are not valid. And so I think, as I said, I'm really excited by what I see coming out of youth. I'm really excited by sort of the analysis. Another story that I can tell is that I was on a webinar, and there was a director from one of the federal ministries, and they had run a program in St. Jamestown in Toronto. And for those who don't know, St. Jamestown is one of the priority neighborhoods in Toronto for low-income youth. So they ran this workshop series with youth to understand the issues of what's going on in the communities and build programs related to marginalized youth. And he was like, it was the most nuanced and in-depth analysis of issues from marginalized youth that he had ever heard in his 20-year career. And it came from marginalized youth who had never gone to, these are high school students, they'd never gone to university, and they were giving in-depth, nuanced analysis about what was going on in their communities and what the solutions need to be. And so I think we don't tap into those things often enough as educated people, as people who have PhDs and masters. We've talked a lot, or I've heard a lot talked at this conference around Western science and sort of the way that we center Western science. And so I'm like, I don't care about Western science. I care about what the community is saying. How do we center the voice of communities? How do we go into the communities? Because it may not be blind peer reviewed by 3 professors, but I guarantee you it's peer reviewed by the community. There are people in the community talking to each other who are verifying what's going on, who are undertaking processes to understand what's going on in those communities. But we don't tap into that knowledge. That knowledge is not valid within our context. So we're building a program at work, and the partner that we were talking to was like, yeah, we want to bring in a professor to make our results more valid. I'm like, why do we need a professor to to take community input and make it more valid. Like, the community's input is valid on its own. It's that is rich, detailed knowledge that we should be thanking the community for sharing with us, and using to better those communities. But that's not the way that we think about it. And so, I haven't seen the sort of youth anger of like, you did this is your problem, but I have seen the youth anger of, you're centering yourselves, you're not including us in this conversation, and we have a stake in this too. And so, when we center solutions that are centered around people who are centering themselves, who are older, who've worked in this space for a long time, who don't understand intersectionality or the driving systems that are causing the climate crisis, that is a problem, and that's something we need to break through.
We have one last question over here.
Hi, my name's Andrew Howe from Nova Scotia, Halifax. And my question, we came in late, so it might have been addressed earlier, but what I was wondering is if you have experienced in working with Black youth specifically, sort of this idea that the climate issue and the climate concern is sort of an issue for those people over there. It's not really something that we deal with. And if you could just speak a little bit on some ways to empower Black youth so that they understand that not only is this going to affect you, but there are things that you can do and sort of you have valuable input as well. So some suggestions on how to take that back and sort of impart that in my community.
Yeah, so I think there's the first part, which is, Black youth thinking that this is their problem. And I understand that because they don't see themselves in the movement. They don't see themselves in this work. The solutions do not work with them. The solutions have not centered them. And so I totally understand sort of that perspective of like, that's those people's problem over there. That's not my problem. To answer your second question, that's why I think intersectionality is so important. I can go into a racialized community in Toronto, or maybe I'll back up and use my mom as an example because I love this example. If I went to my mom and said, "Mom, you need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the climate is changing, we need to do something about it," she's not going to know. She's not going to be able to have that conversation. But, my mom is an avid gardener. She has 100 plants on her front lawn. She has about 100 in her backyard. She has about 100 in her house. And she has 2 community garden plots within her community. And so if I go to her and have a conversation about, the changing seasons and how that's affecting growing patterns and the weeds and the pests that she's having to deal with that she may not have to deal with 5 years ago, that's a conversation that I can have with her, and she's going to have lots to say and lots to input on. And so this is where when we talk about climate change and climate action, we want to go, the sort of current knowledge is we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to get people to do that, and we know what we need to do. And we're not having that conversation with folks centering what they're interested in. We did some focus groups at the foundation as a part of our election work, and we asked people about the message of you need to vote with climate and nature and climate in mind. And most people were like, that message means nothing to me. I don't understand what it means. I don't understand how that plays into my day-to-day lives. And so our reaction to that work is now we're doing some research into how can we link the climate action and climate work message to the messages that are relevant to our context. And we're starting with Ontario, so that's affordability, housing, healthcare is a big issue in Ontario right now. And so, how do we have that conversation across these issues as opposed to we need to have the conversation about climate change? Because there is so much rich knowledge there. When I was working in Mississauga, whenever we'd have this conversation around climate change, we would just start with, where were you on July 8th when the big flood happened here in Toronto? Where were you on the ice storm that happened that year was 3 days before Christmas? Where were you during that ice storm? you know? And so we heard from city staff of like, yeah, I couldn't get a hold of my director, and we had to go out on the street and clean trees, and like, you know, this person was calling that person, and we could have this really rich discussion about climate change that was centered in, here's my experience, here's what I went through on this event, and this is how it affects me. And so, you know, I really believe that's part of like meeting people where they are. It's not only literally going to where they are, but we have to meet them where they are in terms of their mindset, in terms of the conversation. And climate change is so all-encompassing. I guarantee if you give me a topic, I can find that connection for you. And if I can't find it, I know somebody who will be able to find that connection. And so this conversation, having an intersectional conversation brings more people to the table, brings more people into the conversation, and we meet more people in this conversation, not less. When we center people who are climate experts, like me, we get a very specific point of view, we get a very specific solutions, we get a very specific answer. You know, one of the best climate tools we have, or the ongoing message around the best climate tool is carbon pricing, which is a market-based mechanism. How has the market and capitalism harmed racialized and indigenous people in this country for literally hundreds of years? And that is our best tool. And so, you know, these are the types of conversations we need to have in this space, and that's how you bring a Black youth into this conversation, is like, how is his life going to be affected? What are the issues that are important to him? And have that conversation about how can we address those things that are important to you through addressing climate change, as opposed to like, climate change is important and you need to care about this thing. Because there's lots of people who frankly will never care about it, but they care about those things, and so how do we make those connections? And so going back to the gun violence incident, I think there should be climate organizations that are funding gang exit programs, that are funding social justice programs, because that is climate adaptation. Hotter our summers get, we're going to see more violence during the summer. So how do we prevent that risk? We get climate change money funding social justice programs. And so these are all connections that I think we need to think about as we do this work. And so I would challenge everybody here today to think about, even all your existing programs, your existing exhibits, how can you create those connections to climate change? How can you create those connections to these issues and to other issues that are going on in your communities, or going on or are coming up at your places? Because I know, working for the city, we know that no matter what topic we're engaging the city on, we're going to hear about every issue. Somebody's going to show up to that just to talk about, you know, the pothole on their street that's been there for 18 years. And so, you know, how are we mining that information, understanding we're going to get it, and then using that as an entry point into conversations with folks. And entry points are really important in this work, because climate change is still quite esoteric. Climate change is still not quite knowledge. There's been a lot of talk about literacy, and so we may not even need to increase literacy. We just need to be able to have those conversations with what people are literate in.
Thank you so much, Julius. I think that takes us to time. I see Marianne nodding away, but lots to take away from this conversation. Really appreciate you spending this afternoon with us.
Thanks for having me.